right, welcome back to our next edition of Luther and our journey to Worms, as it were. I'm beginning to realize that this is going to take a little bit longer than I expected to. Let me see here in my calendar. We have basically 2 weeks left, and I know this is going to take me more than just two more episodes, so I'm going to try and start getting these out sooner and sooner. And the good news, at least now, I'm not in such a position where I have to talk quietly and just like this and just in the very sleepy kind of. Hopefully you're not going to get really super tired of this, and I can, make this a little bit more presentable and stuff. I've been given some time here to finish up a lot of these a lot of my notes on this, and just be able to deliver it to you, and just better delivery time, I guess. But anyways, we're going to continue on with the series on Luther and his journey to Worms, how the Reformation got started. Luther is typically the focus because it was Luther who basically set the match. It is also important to note, I've learned this over the last couple of years. I mean, for me, it started with Luther. It's a great way to start, but again, as I've tried to point out, and hopefully I've done a good job of it, is that it's not really just as simple as Luther. I mean, especially when I listened to R.C. Sproul's stuff on it, he always portrayed it as though Luther was the only guy who was doing all this stuff, and Luther was just a lone wolf in his fight against Rome. But that's not really what happened. That's really not the case. Luther had a lot of support, and frankly, he's not the only reformer that ever existed. There was a lot of reformers that he influenced, but Luther can't run a Reformation in all of Europe. So you have Butzer, you have Zwingli, these other guys in different areas who contemporaries of Luther, and they're starting Reformations in their lands and stuff like that. So, and then even in Wittenberg, Luther has a lot of help from his guys like his closest friend Melanchthon, who we're going to talk a little bit about here. But just that kind of note, as we're going to see, Luther has a lot of help, a lot of support. But we're going to focus right now on Luther's sort of his life in we've seen him enter the monastery, and we've seen what kind of life that gave to him over and against the kind of life he was hoping it would give him. And you might be thinking, wow, that's rough for Luther. It's a tough break, and hopefully things get better. Well, they don't. They don't get better for him. You're going to see here that things get a little worse. Sometimes I guess they have to get worse before they get better for Luther. But we're going to just sort of pick up here. In 1508, Luther joined the university in Wittenberg as a junior professor. We talked about that in the last. That's sort of where we ended in the last one. And as previously stated, Staupitz hoped that in giving Luther more responsibilities, sort of pursuing his academic career, it would take his mind off of his tormented soul and onto and really helping people, and hoping that him helping people would in turn help him in answering his own dilemmas, his great struggle for peace with God that Luther wanted more than anything. Now, that's one of the ways that Staupitz did this for Luther. He had Luther pursue an academic career. Now, there's another thing that Staupitz will do, and the monastery, has some business with Rome that it needs to settle, and so Staupitz needs to send a couple friars to Rome to do that. And Staupitz thinks this would be a good opportunity for Luther, again, to help him find answers to his great struggles, and maybe he'll stop spending 6 hours in confession. Give me a bit of a break. Not because Staupitz doesn't care about Luther, but because Staupitz realizes Luther's got some issue right here, and clearly confession is not going to help him. The confession system that they had is not helping him Luther has a deeper problem going on, and maybe if I have him do these things, it's going to help him find restitution, find peace for his soul. And so there's another one of the things that Staupitz does is he figures, hey, I can kill two birds with one stone, as it were. Luther being one of those birds, and so that way was to send Luther along with another friar to Rome, and this happened in 1511 for business issues with the monastery. So in 1508 he joins the monastery, and in 1511, when was, by the way, let me just make sure I'm getting some of the timelines going on. He joins the monastery in 1505, and he's going to, I want to, okay, I'm going to look it up here. Make sure I get these right. I'm going to use my references here. This, by the way, is Nick Needham. Nick Needham's 2,000 Years of Christ's Power. This is volume 3, Renaissance and the Reformation, which is one of my sources for getting all my most of the information. I don't typically use one source of history, history books. I have this. I have Ligonier has helped me out in a lot of ways. I have another source on YouTube that helps me. Various different sources. It's always good to get a good rounded group of sources for your historical studies. It gives you different perspectives and different emphasis on this. But like, again, R.C. Sproul, he really put a lot of emphasis just on Luther himself. And whereas, Nick Needham, he put a lot of emphasis on Luther because Luther is a central figure in the Reformation. But he also puts a lot of emphasis on Zwingli, which you never really hear from with Sproul. So he helped me understand Zwingli and Luther's conflict with Zwingli later on and all that stuff like that, and just understand Zwingli's theology. But anyways, so yes, he became a junior lecturer in 1508. So 2 years after he joins the monastery. 3 years, sorry. My math is not great. 3 years after, he's becomes the junior lecturer, and he's ordained to the priesthood in 1507. That's the date I was looking for. 1507, he's ordained to the priesthood. 1508 is when he joins. He becomes a junior lecturer at Wittenberg. I had my, there you go. I use random cards as my bookmarks these days. So yes. So then in 1511 is when Luther is sent on for business issues. He's sent to Rome for business issues with the monastery. Now, in that day, a pilgrimage to Rome was a journey to. It was really important. This was a journey to a really a big cathedral. You had churches and you had cathedrals. I hate to say this. I hope I don't want to become. I don't want to say things that are offensive here to people who may be Roman Catholic. I'm not. That's not what I want to do with this. Even though I very clearly will disagree with Roman Catholicism's gospel. But nevertheless, there's a lot of similarity in concept here between Mormon, Latter-day Saint sort of culture and Roman Catholic culture, or I don't want to say theology, but religious practices. Because if you go to Utah, especially when you go to sort of the holy city of Mormonism, which is Salt Lake City, there's temples like everywhere. They're all over the place. You're driving down the highway and you're kind of up above the buildings, and you can just see them, spot them. Just there's one over there, there's one over there, there's one over there, and you can just see them. And literally, I always forget which freeway it is, but as the main freeway that takes us from Provo to Salt Lake City, there's a point where they're actually building a temple right next to the freeway. I don't know what it looks like today, how far along its construction has come, but there it is, sitting right there. So there's temples all over the place, and in Luther's day, you could look at the cathedrals like the temples in Latter-day Saint world. Again, I'm not trying to be offensive. I'm sorry if I am. It's not a world I dwell in, really. So, but and of course in Latter-day Saint theology, the temples are extremely important. Well, it's the same thing with cathedrals. You have in Latter-day Saint theology, you sort of have your standard churches, which are what you might call the wards. When you drive past a Latter-day Saint church that has, it's always got the spire and everything like that, that's not a temple. That's just a ward. Here in San Antonio, we have a temple. It's way out by the 281 and 1604 area, Stone Oak areas. So basically the north, just sort of mid-northeast side. And in Luther's day, there's a similarity in concept. You have just sort of the churches, but you also have the cathedrals, which are much bigger and much more grandiose and everything like that. Beautiful, absolutely, just like the Mormon temples. Gorgeous, very beautiful, very pretty. For me, that's about it. That's all it is to me. It's a nice, beautiful looking building, but one that I would definitely love to tour, for the tour's sake. I always love to learn new things. I love to learn about even religions that I disagree with. I would walk into a mosque and just see what it's like, not because I actually believe in Islam, but because I'm always fascinated with these religious movements and stuff like that. Satanic temples would be a little bit of a different situation. But anyways, I'm going off the beaten trail here. So going to Rome to pursue a pilgrimage to a great cathedral is really important, because in these cathedrals are what you would, especially in Rome, are what you would find what are called relics. Just what they're called, relics. A relic is basically a ancient artifact that has been that the church has been collecting, particularly the Western Church has been collecting, putting in their cathedrals, and these relics are used for indulgence purposes. I'm going to talk about indulgences for a moment in a moment, but so that's what a pilgrimage is. It's a journey to a grand cathedral, in some ways, a modern day temple, that contain what we would call relics, or a holy relic. Now, these relics could be things like, a lock of hair from Mary's scalp or something like that. It's a piece of the cross, the Holy Grail. Those would be considered relics. These are physical pieces of ancient biblical history. Now, whether these items that are claimed to be things like a lock of hair from Mary's head are actually that, no one can really know. It's just alleged. It's claimed by the church. I guess all that stuff. I guess that's where the dogmatic, the dogmas come in. Die fide, by faith, and trusting that the Pope's dogmatic claims, all the stuff like that. You would have to believe that. But we can't really prove that these really were what they are. If we could, those relics would not be, well, they might be. It could be in a church. A lot of them wouldn't be, though. But anyways, again, I digress. But there are other things, too. You're going to have, like, the bones of the apostles that could be relics. And these relics functions to attain indulgences. Let's see here. And to visit the relic was one way to attain what we call an indulgence. An indulgence was and is, it still is, basically a bonus point for you in purgatory. And again, this is where, I just want to say I'm not trying to belittle Roman Catholic theology. I'm not trying to sound condescending or patronizing to it. I'm just trying to come up with ways for people who aren't Roman Catholic to understand how to think about these things. And because again, it's very difficult for us, any of us, to get out of our own modes of thinking. As we're going to learn here, Luther struggled with that greatly. But in some ways, it is kind of important if you're trying to meaningfully understand the way someone else thinks. When I talk to the Latter-day Saints, try to evangelize to them, as it were. Part of that involves me understanding the way they think and how they talk, and understanding how they see the gospel, how they see God, how they see Scripture, how they see the church, and everything like that, and just trying to figure out how they see it, so that I can better communicate to them. So these are ways that I'm just using these as examples to understand a way that you can think about these things. And so when I talk about things like what I'm about to say right now, I hope this it's not meant to be offensive. So an indulgence was and is basically a bonus point for you in purgatory. It's almost like a discount or a coupon ticket kind of thing. It doesn't get you out of purgatory, but it's going to help you deeply reduce your purgatory time frame. Now, Rome was, in that day, the Jerusalem of Western Christianity. I mean, it kind of is, you know. And so for Luther, this trip to Rome, again, this is still pre-Reformation Luther, so he's still very much in love with the church, and he absolutely believes in the church. He believes in the primacy of the Pope, all this stuff. He believes all of it. The Mass, even the Roman Catholic view of the Mass, Luther holds to it fully and completely. In some ways, much more than his own peers, to be honest with you. But this trip to Rome, so this trip to Rome for Luther in 1511 was exciting, to say the very least. One of Luther's hopes in this trip was to acquire an indulgence for his parents. Of course, at this time, his parents were still alive, and so he couldn't use his indulgence for them. Thus, he decided he would use his indulgence for his, like his grandparents, However, just like with his monastic experience, instead of finally getting the peace and joy he desperately wanted, Luther would once again be disillusioned. And this time, not by the reality of the futility of relying on his own willpower, his own strength to be made worthy in God's sight. Again, he's operating in the worldview and the perspective of Roman Catholicism, or the Western Church at that time. They didn't call it Roman Catholicism at the time. The term Roman Catholicism is a later term to distinguish between Protestants and Roman Catholics. This is another one of the issues with church history. I'll just note this real quick. When I'm writing stuff on the Trinity in the early church, proving its existence well before Nicaea. I might even make some videos on it, because I've been arguing with a lot of oneness Pentecostals on it, and they're constantly making the arguments there was no Trinity in the Bible, there's no Trinity, and the word's not there. None of the early church until Nicaea said it. And that's not true, by the way, but one of the points I make in these articles that I'm writing, I was planning on making it one article, but it's being split up into a couple different ones, at least 3. But one of the points I'm making is that, yes, you're right that there was a point early on when the word Trinity wasn't used until Tertullian came around, which is in like the 3rd century. But why not before that? Because that's the 3rd century. That means there's been like 3 centuries that the term was never used, and yet it's central to the Christian faith. Why is that, Chase? The reason why is because in the earliest days, the terms Trinity, the distinction between being and 3 persons, one being and 3 persons, no one needed to do it at that time. There was no need for it, because nobody was questioning these things. I always tell these folks, I'm always, you think the patristic fathers and the apostolic fathers are just sitting around going, hey, you know what? I'm bored right now, so I'm just going to write a book on the Trinity and the triune nature of God. No, they didn't have time for that kind of stuff like that. Number one, there was no reason to make the distinctions or to start talking about the Trinity party or anything like that. There was no need for that, because no one was challenging the concept of the Trinity or the way we should see God until the Sabellian crisis and the Arian crisis after that. The debate with the Origenists and everything, all that stuff. I'm not going to get into that here, but there was no need to do any of that stuff at that time. So that's one thing. The second thing is, the Christians are kind of struggling to just stay alive for a lot of the times. They don't have time. Like I said, they don't have time to just sit around and just write books on the Trinity. The only reason that these started happening was because, well, go back to Tertullian. He started finding out about this guy named Praxeas who's saying, this weird stuff, and he's going, hey, I got to correct this guy. And so that's where it starts, and that's where that carries on over into the 4th century, which people think climaxed in the Council of Nicaea 325. It actually didn't. It's actually much later on with like the Athanasian Creed and everything like that, all that stuff. These are just parts of the history that most of your cult friends never want to study, because they're not interested in looking into this stuff. They really don't care. They read this off of a website that's probably some King James onlyist website. Doesn't actually do their own history either. Never actually seriously studies the stuff. They've just made up their mind, and all they're looking for now is information that's going to confirm the biases in their minds. That's not how you do history. It's certainly not how I want to do history. When I talk to you about these things, like we're doing right now, I want to actually give you the real history. But again, I'm making this point way too long. But point here is that it's not until later on that we begin to make the distinctions between the Nicene party and the Arian parties and stuff like that. They had to make these distinctions because these debates were going on, and you made these distinctions to tell which side you were on in the debate. Well, it's the same thing when it happens in the Reformation. There was no Roman Catholic Church before the Reformation. It was, they called it, we call it the Western Church because it's a little bit more accurate. It's the church, sort of in the West, as opposed to the church in the East and all that stuff like that. But again, you made those distinctions because there was a split in Christendom. And so you made the distinctions between the West and the East. Well, before that, there was no need to make the distinctions. And now we have the split between Rome and the Protestant churches. And so you would have the Protestants and the Roman Catholics. You can't just say the Western Church because Protestantism comes out of the Western Church. So if you just say Western Church, well, what does that mean? So in the Western tradition, as it were, you have to make the distinction now between Protestant and Roman Catholic, and that's how they did it. So, but all that to just basically say that, just to get that sort of out there, and just it's a fun little fact, I think, if you want to get into history and stuff like that. And it's one of the reasons why, again, I made those distinctions in the first video. I wanted to make a distinction between Western and Eastern Church because during Luther's day, the Western Church wasn't called the Roman Catholic Church. It was just the church. But we're going to call it the Western Church. Anyways, let's see here. So just like his monastic life, instead of finally getting the peace and joy he desperately wanted, Luther would once again be disillusioned. This time he would not be by his feudal strength to be seen as right before God, but he would see in Rome, he would be disillusioned by the debauchery he saw in Rome. So a couple examples here. For example, the priests in Rome would perform rapid masses, so they weren't regarding the mass as Mass is a serious issue in Roman Catholicism. It's another one of the serious differences between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. But these guys would just sort of flippantly just sort of fly right through the Mass, sort of thing, and they would just perform numerous Masses in a day. And the more they did it, the more funds they collect from the Mass. And so, in other words, the reason why they were doing these is to just collect funds. It had nothing to do with actually presenting the body and blood for the congregation in sort of remission of sins and the replenishment of their souls and all that stuff. Again, the Mass being extremely important in the Christian life. If you were excommunicated and you were not allowed to receive Mass, you're screwed. That's not a good thing. That's tantamount to judgment. And so when you're treating the Mass in this way as a profiteering mechanism, that's kind of a serious deal, especially for a guy like Luther. So instead of reverence for the Mass, which at that time Luther had a very high regard of, the Mass was degraded and used simply as a means to fill the pockets of the priests and their ministry. Now, another one of the deeply scandalous things that Luther saw was he saw regularly the use of prostitution by the priests, done openly and without shame. That was another serious issue for Luther. These are priests. These are priests, man. that's, wow. I don't know what I would do if I saw that. I'd be like, dude, who's in charge here? This can't stand. Imagine in your area of churches, you were just finding out that your pastors and elders and whatever are just sleeping around with any woman they want, and doing it openly. Typically, we would say that's cause for disqualification, and you're out of there, kind of thing. But it's just, and this is happening in Rome. Like, where's the Pope? What's going on here? But anyways, Luther, while in Rome, one of his biggest hopes, what he really wanted to do while he was in Rome, again, he wants to acquire an indulgence. And so what he wants to do, he wants to climb what are called the sacred steps in the Lateran Church. Sacred steps, which are alleged to be the steps in which Christ was walked upon, and where Christ went to be judged by Pilate. So the Crusaders brought the steps from Jerusalem back to Rome, and so these are now considered a relic. And so you can acquire an indulgence by performing a particular rite on the steps. By the way, those steps are still in Rome today, and people still perform this indulgence rite. I'm just going to call it indulgence rite. They still do it today, Roman Catholics, who go on pilgrimages to Rome. Anyways, he wanted to climb the sacred steps in what was called the Lateran Church, which was the main cathedral in Rome before the new St. Petersburg was constructed. Now, to be able to climb these steps, repeat the Hail Marys, it would attain for Luther the amount of indulgence he needed for his grandparents. Perhaps, even though everything else in Rome had failed him, perhaps humans were humans and always sinful, but the sacred steps, the sacred steps aren't human. So Luther sees this debauchery among the priesthood, and it's incredibly discouraging for him. But the sacred steps, these humans are always going to let you down. Luther knows this in his own soul. But the sacred steps, that's holy. That's my Lord stepped on these steps, and he's never let me down. And so the steps in which his feet touched and pressed upon to push him up to where he was going could certainly not fail me. Because these weren't human, they weren't sinful. So this is going to be it. This is it. I'm finally going to get to see a relic and acquire an indulgence. And so he's going to perform the rite. So what he does is, he does the rite. Which is basically you crawl on each step on your knees, and you kiss each step as you go up. And you say Hail Marys, and you just repeat the process till you go all the way to the very top. And there you go, there you have it. But even this left him with a deep and heart-wrenching disappointment. After performing the rite upon the sacred steps, once he reached the top, Luther simply said, "Who knows if it's true? Who knows if it is true?" And just like that, everything he dreamed of, his hopes of reconciliation and peace, just like in his personal monastic life, was crushed. So Luther would later in life use an old Italian proverb: "If there is a hell, Rome was built over it." So imagine that, man. This young man. Again, I just have such empathy for Luther. The torment of his soul. At this point, you got to be considering suicide. There's nothing. There's no peace in my heart over what I'm doing. I've tried everything and nothing works. It's hopeless. There's just nothing left to do. There's got to be horrible feeling in his heart. But nevertheless, upon returning to Wittenberg, Luther continued his studies and his lectures in the university, and he receives his degree in 1512. So about, a year later after he goes to Rome, he receives his degree in 1512. So he would soon replace Staupitz in Wittenberg as professor of Bible study. Luther would emphasize studies in, the Psalms, Romans, Hebrews, and Galatians. During this time, Luther had begun to develop and utilize a form of interpretation called what we would call the sensus literalis. That's Latin, which is the fundamental or literal interpretation of Scripture. Today we would commonly call this the historical grammatical method of interpretation. So put simply, this means that the proper way to interpret the Bible is to begin with what the text means over and against the scholastic methods developed through the Middle Ages, which often relied on allegorical interpretations, which allowed the readers and interpreters to attain whatever meaning they wanted out of simply allegorizing or spiritualizing the text. Luther was introduced, it was influenced by the likes of the humanists Jacques Lefebvre d'Etaples, I screwed that up so badly, and Reuchlin, from whom Luther learned Hebrew. So Luther learns from Reuchlin, he learns the Old Testament languages, or Hebrew. Along with these, what Luther's learning in these men, these humanist scholars, along with this, his close friend in Wittenberg, Philip Melanchthon, or Melanchthon, you could say Melanchthon or Melanchthon, I just usually say Melanchthon. I sort of try to put them both together a little bit. It's a cool name though, Melanchthon. Philip Melanchthon helped Luther understand the Greek language of the New Testament. So Melanchthon is, again, another character that, for example, you would usually never really hear about in Ligonier's his church history stuff. So if you only have one source of your studying your church history, you're gonna miss certain characters because they sometimes don't focus on these other characters, and so you miss out. As much as you're getting some good information on like Luther, you're missing out on Melanchthon. I love learning about Melanchthon. Oh my gosh, I relate to Melanchthon so much. We're gonna talk a little bit more about Melanchthon and Luther here. I'll try to throw that in here a little bit. But his good friend, his really close friend, Luther had a close relationship with Philip Melanchthon, who was a fellow teacher, a professor in Wittenberg. There's a funny meme that goes on social media. How does an introvert acquire friends? Usually it's just, I'm sort of generalizing it, but and ruining the joke horribly. But it's basically like, an extrovert finds them and brings them along with everywhere they go, and they become very best friends. And I was thinking about this a little while ago, particularly thinking about Luther's relationship with Melanchthon. Again, Luther considers Melanchthon his best friend. And now, why is that? Why is that? Because these two guys are total opposites of each other. Luther is very in many ways bombastic. He's extremely emotive. He's very extroverted. The description I get of Luther is very extroverted, very empathetic, and just outgoing kind of guy. He's got a lot of energy and stuff like that. Melanchthon's the total opposite. He's very quiet. He's very reserved. He does not have the explosive behavior and character of Luther by any stretch of the imagination. Luther reflects on his relationship with Melanchthon many times. But so how do these two become friends? Honestly, what I think it is, what it is when you got a character like Luther who has probably, if we were to diagnose him today, might have something like ADHD or something like that. Just very energetic, a lot all this stuff. And I know characters like this in my life. My own brother is kind of like it. He just goes boom, 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 boom. It just like never stops. It's almost exhausting for someone like me who's very introverted. And I think the reason why extroverts love these introverts like that, extroverts like Luther love introverts like Melanchthon, is because Melanchthon will sit there as Luther is just pouring out his soul and listen to him. And Melanchthon's clearly, as you can tell, a good listener. And so they have such great conversations. Luther may have he just throws thoughts out there just from the hip, just goes boom, 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 boom like that. And sometimes they may not come out quite properly or the way he intended them to come out. And Melanchthon is the kind of guy who might help him understand what's going on in his mind. And I think Luther values that greatly. So what basically we have for Luther, what Luther has in Melanchthon is a guy who's going to listen to him and all the weirdness that he is. And that's why they become great friends. And not only that, but Melanchthon is fully in supportive of Luther in his endeavors and his theological endeavors when Luther eventually takes on scholasticism in 1517, which is what sparked the Reformation. But Melanchthon is behind him the whole time. He's with Luther the whole time. Supports Luther, even though Melanchthon never really, like Luther, never got directly involved in the controversies. That was something that Luther was just born for. Not so much Melanchthon. But Melanchthon, nevertheless, was a huge support in helping Luther and navigating this. And I think Luther valued that greatly. That's why Melanchthon was probably Luther's greatest friend in his whole life. But anyways, so along with this, learning the Hebrew language, his Luther's close friend in Wittenberg, Philip Melanchthon, helped him understand the Greek language of the New Testament. Combining all of this, Luther would eventually come to the historical grammatical interpretation, which focused on exegesis, which means bringing out from the text what it means, rather than scholastic allegorical interpretations, or what we might call eisegesis, reading into the text the person's meaning, rather than bringing out of the text what God means. Another way to put this in very simple terms, the grammatical historical method is focused on explaining the text as it is and then making application based on that, while the allegorical perspective focused entirely on application, and thus the text becomes what Luther would call a waxed nose that you could shape and warp into anything you wanted. This, to Luther, sapped the scriptures of their true meaning and what God intends for his people to hear. So, an even more simple way to put this, the grammatical historical method, which is the best way to interpret. I mean, it makes the most sense to me. It means you explain the text first, and then you make application. You don't make application whereby you just cancel out explaining the text. And so you start with what the text actually means first, and then you're allowed to make application. And if you do that backwards, you basically throw out interpreting the text at all. And that's an abuse of God's word. I would consider it sinful. And I think that's, you're going to have a lot to answer for when you face God for all that stuff. I don't want to have to answer for that. And so I'm trying to keep that, I'm trying not to misinterpret scripture as much as I possibly can. But I remember when I was first starting my Christian journey, I went to this college here locally called Trinity University, and it is a liberal cesspool. I didn't realize it at the time, but it really is. And I'm so grateful to God that he led me out of that stuff. It's just all him and just what he's done. I mean, I was a clueless Christian, totally vulnerable to anything. I could have easily been influenced by all that garbage that was going on there, all the Christian Bible study garbage that was going on there. Could have easily been influenced by all that stuff and just ended up a liberal wacko with different colors in my hair and couldn't tell if I was a boy or a girl, anything like that, at this point. It's just God's grace that has kept me, led me in the right direction. But at that time, I was partaking in these Bible studies because I was becoming a Christian. I wanted to be among other Christian peers. And so these guys fit the bill, at least the Christian peers part. But we would do these Bible studies where what we would do is we would get into groups. We'd get into groups and you'd have your text that you're supposed to read. And as we're reading it, the question simply was asked, what does this mean to you? That was it. I'm dead serious. That was it. And I'm looking back now and I'm like, holy smokes, it's just horrible. If I knowing what I know now, and I went to those studies, and I was put in those groups, and it was like, and the group leader goes, or somebody in the group goes, all right, so what does this text mean to us? I'm going to look at them and be like, what's it mean to me? But what does it actually mean? That's what I'm going to ask. I think that's more important, right? And then when we figure out what it actually means, what it's actually telling us, then we can maybe think about what it means to me, what it's telling me. But you can't do it the other way around, because then it just turns everything, like Luther said, into a wax nose. It's all subjective. Nothing about it is objective. You can eventually spiritualize the whole thing, and now whether it's actually historical, it doesn't matter. And what matters is the allegorical stuff you get out of it, and you're basically undermining the Christian faith, because the Christian faith, even though it's very personal to each and every single one of us, it's still an objective reality. It's based in objective reality, and that's really important. So through all of this, through all of what Luther is starting to learn in how to interpret the Bible, and he doesn't really realize it yet, but he's beginning to really break away from the way he was raised to understand Christianity and the scriptures, and the way he was taught. Again, he doesn't realize this yet. He hasn't, even what we're about to talk about now, it's not going to cause Luther to go, and here I stand. It's not going to do that. We'll get to it. But through all of this, Luther would eventually have what we commonly call today the Tower experience, which in my personal opinion, we don't know exactly when this happened, but it likely occurred around 1513 to 1515. And now certainly I think, some people say it happened later, even after his 1517 95 Thesis controversy. To me that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense. I guess I could probably see it, but I'm going to put the date at around 1513 to 1515. And I think it's certainly before he started the indulgence controversy in 1517. So what happened was Luther was studying for his lectures, and he was reading Romans 1:17. And I'll read it really quick here. I just happened to have it. I was looking at it for this video, but I wasn't planning on reading it. But I'll just read it real quick here in the ESV. In Romans 1:17 it says, For in it, the gospel, the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. As it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. Or the just. Now, just as was normal for Luther, the constant reminder of the righteousness of God was a terror to him. Because he had always read this in the medieval background he was raised in. And the righteousness of God was always seen as that righteousness that God required for people to live by or to attain so that they could stand just in his sight. And Luther knew he could never do it. So as always, this frustrated Luther. And here was a man who was professor of biblical studies. I mean, he's a professor of biblical studies. He's about to lecture on Romans 1:17. He's supposed to provide clarity and peace to his own students. And yet Luther himself, the teacher, couldn't find it himself. How do you expect to teach a class on the subject that you struggle with? You yourself cannot get your mind around. That's got to be frustrating. It's got to be discouraging. It's got to be just sad. Anyways, but as we said, his close friend in the university, Melanchthon, was an expert in Greek, and he helped Luther understand what the Greek had meant over against the Latin, which is the Vulgate, which was the common translation in the West. In Latin, the word for righteousness in Romans 1:17, justificare, means to make righteous. However, with Melanchthon's Greek understanding, Luther began to realize that in the Greek, not in the Latin, here means a righteousness that God gives or provides, and a righteousness God offers through trusting faith. This again highlights one of the fundamental differences between Protestantism and Roman Catholicism. In Roman Catholicism, justification is what we call a forensic justification, meaning it is real and tangible in the believer that becomes greater and greater as the Christian remains in the sacramental system of Rome. In the Protestant view, justification is a legal justification, meaning that the Christian is legally declared just by faith in Christ, not by their sanctification in the sacrament. So again, if we want to go back to the car analogy here real quick that I mentioned in the last video, justification in Roman Catholicism is you have this car. This car has been given to you by grace, not by your works, but your works are going to preserve this car. And if you don't, then the car rots and rusts and it gets thrown away, and you're not in good shape by that point. That would basically be the Roman Catholic view. And in the Protestant view is, here's this beautiful car. It is God's car. And it being God's car never blemishes, always perfect, and beautiful, shines gloriously. It's not your car, it's God's. But God has legally written your name as the owner of that car, even though it's not really yours. You didn't work for that. You don't maintain that. None of that stuff. You are still made the legal owner of that car. That's the Protestant view. It's a legal declaration. And in the Roman Catholic view, you want to present your car, that's, in other words, forensic evidence, present your car to God at the end of your life. Here's my car. Here's how well I took care of it. Let me into heaven, kind of thing like that. Or if it's not good enough, I'll go into purgatory and I'll fix it up, however I got to do, and then bring it back to you, kind of thing like that. So that's the difference. But all right, so once Luther began to realize that his standing before God did not rely on his human performance, but on the finished work of Christ on his behalf, it changed the way Luther read the Bible, and indeed, it would begin to change his entire outlook on life, and as we will see, church life. In a future video, we're going to see how this new revolutionary way, not really revolutionary, it's really actually what the Bible actually says. But once Luther rediscovers this truth that was lost for quite a while, it's going to have an impact on the way he sees the church, the way he sees the Christian, the life of the believer, everything. It's going to impact everything. The way he reads the Bible, the way he sees God, everything. It's going to impact. But the point, like I was mentioning before a moment ago, it's not going to hit him immediately. He's going to have this big breakthrough, which Luther describes as, it was like paradise, the doors of paradise, came open, and I walked in suddenly. He said it was like that's when he was born again, when he realized this truth. It's not upon my works. My works don't get me into heaven. My works don't assure my place in heaven. It's my trust in the single sacrifice of Christ. These are things that Luther's going to begin to understand. First, he understands the righteousness here is the righteousness that God gives. He's going to start really, his doctrine of faith is going to develop afterwards, but we don't want to get too ahead of ourselves. But it's not going to, this revolutionary idea, sure, it's going to affect the way Luther lives his life, but it's not going to really start having an impact until he gets into the indulgence controversy, and that he's going to start being forced to start reconsidering and thinking about more things as resistance is piled on him. So we're going to see that in future videos. So for now, here's this one. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it's a little bit more maybe energetic, I guess. I don't know. But just that you enjoyed this video and that you found it very informative. So, Soli Deo Gloria, guys. I'll see you next time, Lord willing. God bless. Bye.